Pacific skies, late 1944. The morning sun burns through a thin veil of clouds above the Philippine Sea. Below, endless blue. Above, a silver streak, fast and unrelenting. A lone P-51D Mustang dives out of the light, its .650 caliber Browning machine guns thundering in perfect rhythm. Tracers carve red arcs across the sky. Ahead, a group of Mitsubishi A6M-Zeros scramble in defense, elegant, lethal, but hopelessly outmatched. The Japanese pilots twist and climb, but the Mustang holds the advantage. Its Merlin engine, a deep, resonant roar of mechanical genius, drives it higher, faster, farther. One Zero bursts into flames, spiraling down toward the sea. Another veers away, smoke trailing from a shredded wing. From his cockpit, the American pilot steadies his breathing. The battle is over before it even begins. In less than 3 years, the balance of air power had reversed completely. The weapon once feared for its agility now found itself helpless against an aircraft born of pure engineering precision. But this dominance didn't happen overnight. It began with desperation, innovation, and a problem no one in 1940 knew how to solve. The sky belonged to Japan in December 1941. When the Empire of Japan struck across the Pacific, the Allies faced an enemy unlike any they had imagined. The Mitsubishi A6M-Zero, fast, light, and astonishingly agile, dominated the skies from China to the Philippines, Pearl Harbor to Burma. Its secret lay not in firepower, but in engineering philosophy, a philosophy of extreme efficiency. Japanese designers had stripped away armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, and weight wherever possible. The result was an aircraft that could outturn, outclimb, and outrange anything the United States or Britain could field in 1941. At 331 miles per hour, the Zero wasn't the fastest fighter in the world, but its range was revolutionary. With a combat radius of over 1,000 miles, it could accompany bombers far beyond what any Allied fighter could reach. American pilots flying Curtiss P-40 Warhawks, Bell P-39 Airacobras, or Brewster Buffaloes often never saw their enemy before being torn apart in midair. The skies above the Philippines, Wake Island, and Singapore became slaughterhouses. Fighter squadrons were annihilated within weeks. Reports flooded back from frontline bases, stories of aircraft that seemed to defy gravity, fighters that could twist inside their opponent's turns, strike and vanish before retaliation. To American engineers, this wasn't just defeat. It was a wake-up call. The technological shock in early 1942, engineers at North American Aviation, Lockheed, and Republic Aviation pored over combat reports from the Pacific and China-Burma-India theaters. The conclusion was chilling. The United States had entered the war with aircraft designed for another era, machines built for speed and toughness, not agility and endurance. While Japan had invested in lightweight airframes and ultra-efficient engines, the U.S. had prioritized production and standardization. It worked for bombers, but not for dogfights. The Allied response was immediate but chaotic. Design bureaus raced to upgrade existing fighters. Superchargers were added, engines tuned, frames reinforced, but the gap remained. The Zero continued to dictate the tempo of air combat. In the Pacific, Navy pilots slowly learned new tactics, the thatch weave, and energy fighting ways to survive against the Zero's superior turning circle. But these were desperate workarounds, not solutions. The United States needed something entirely new, a machine that could match the Zero's agility, exceed its range, and crush it in speed and climb. A challenge. Across the ocean while the Pacific burned, a quieter crisis unfolded over Europe. The Royal Air Force had its own need for a long-range fighter capable of escorting bombers deep into enemy territory. In 1940, Britain turned to North American Aviation, a company that had never designed a fighter before. The request was audacious: build a high-performance aircraft from scratch and deliver the prototype in less than 120 days. North American's chief designer, Edgar Schmood, accepted. Working with a small team in Inglewood, California, he drew up a revolutionary design: thin, laminar flow wings for reduced drag, an efficient radiator cooling system, and a streamlined fuselage optimized for speed and range. By October 1940, the NA-73X prototype, soon to be called the Mustang, took flight. It was fast, sleek, and stable, yet in combat tests it revealed its greatest flaw: the Allison V1710 engine. Powerful at low altitude, it suffocated above 15,000 feet, a fatal limitation in the high skies where bombers and interceptors fought. An engine without a warplane by 1942, the P-51 was in limited British service as a low-altitude fighter bomber, useful but unspectacular. It was a fine design trapped inside the wrong engine. The Mustang's potential seemed doomed to obscurity. Just another promising prototype lost to wartime urgency. But far away, in the laboratories of Rolls-Royce in Derby, England, engineers were testing a new version of their legendary Merlin engine. The same power plant driving the Spitfire and Hurricane. Someone had the idea to fit it into the Mustang's frame. That single decision would change the course of air warfare and end Japan's aerial supremacy before they even saw it coming. The moment that engine met the Mustang's airframe, the equation of power shifted forever. It was the dawn of a new kind of fighter, one that would carry the war back across the Pacific and into the heart of Japan itself. The meeting of two worlds in the winter of 1942. The British Air Ministry authorized a bold experiment. At Rolls-Royce's Hucknall facility in Nottinghamshire, engineers removed the Allison engine from a P-51 airframe and installed a Merlin 61, a 1,600 horsepower, two-stage, supercharged masterpiece. When test pilot Ronald Harker took the hybrid aircraft into the air, the results stunned everyone present. The Mustang leaped off the runway with unprecedented acceleration. At 30,000 feet, where the Allison had choked for oxygen, the Merlin-powered Mustang surged ahead, climbing, turning, and diving with power to spare. The numbers were extraordinary. A top speed of over 430 miles per hour, service ceiling approaching 40,000 feet, and a range nearly double that of any contemporary Allied fighter. The transformation was immediate and absolute. For the first time, engineers saw a machine that could fight at high altitude, escort bombers deep into enemy territory, and return home without refueling. It was, in every sense, the perfect fusion of two engineering cultures, British craftsmanship and American pragmatism. The birth of the P-51B Mustang by early 1943, North American Aviation began mass-producing the P-51B and P-51C variants, both powered by Packard-built versions of the Merlin engine under license in the United States. The first production model rolled out of the Inglewood plant in June that year. Edgar Schmood and his team had designed more than a fighter. They had created a machine that redefined aerodynamics in combat aviation. The Mustang's laminar flow wing, unique in its precision contouring, reduced drag dramatically, allowing higher speeds with less fuel. Its radiator scoop, placed beneath the fuselage, generated a small amount of jet thrust at high speed, a subtle aerodynamic trick known as the Meredith effect. The aircraft's range now stretched beyond 500 miles with drop tanks enough to escort B-17s and B-24s all the way to Berlin and back. In the Pacific, this would soon mean a direct escort from Iwo Jima to Tokyo, something previously thought impossible. But before the Mustang could fight the Zero, it would have to prove itself against the Luftwaffe. Trial by fire in Europe in late 1943, the P-51 entered service with the 8th Air Force over Western Europe. The timing was perfect and desperate. American bombers flying daylight raids into Germany were suffering catastrophic losses. Then came the Mustangs. Flying high and far, they swept ahead of bomber formations, diving on Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs with relentless speed. Within months, the Luftwaffe's elite fighter units were in retreat. The world's best piston engine, married to the most advanced airframe, had created something almost unfair. A plane faster, longer-legged and deadlier than anything its enemies could field. A design meant for distance while Europe burned, planners in the Pacific took notice. The long distances over ocean, the need to escort B-29 superfortresses to Japan, and the deadly efficiency of Japanese interceptors demanded a fighter of endurance and reach. The Mustang, once dismissed as a European weapon, now seemed like the answer. By 1944, with Iwo Jima secured as a forward base, P-51Ds began to arrive in the Pacific theater. These were the refined models, the bubble canopy Mustangs, giving pilots near 360-degree visibility and housing 6 heavy Browning machine guns. When they lifted off toward the Japanese homeland for the first time, they carried not just bombs and fuel, but years of engineering evolution. The long-range escort fighter that had saved the skies of Europe was about to decide the outcome of the war in Asia. The enemy awakens, too late. By the time the first P-51s reached the Pacific, Japan's aircraft industry was struggling under relentless bombing. Engineers at Nakajima and Kawasaki were rushing to produce new models, the Ki-84 Hayate and the N1K2J Shidenkai fighters that could, on paper, match or even surpass the Mustang. But Japan's industrial base could no longer sustain precision manufacturing. Engines overheated, fuel quality deteriorated, and pilot training collapsed under wartime strain. Against that, the P-51D represented industrial perfection, standardized, powerful, and built in the tens of thousands. The Zero, once a symbol of untouchable dominance, was now a relic, a fragile craft facing a predator designed to exploit every one of its weaknesses. The balance of the air war had shifted forever, and as the P-51 streaked across the Pacific skies toward the Japanese home islands, their pilots carried not just confidence but the certainty that engineering, not luck, now ruled the heavens. The next step in our story reveals how this engineering triumph played out in combat, how design, speed, and endurance transformed tactics, morale, and air strategy itself. Every great weapon of war begins not with a battle but with a blueprint. The P-51 Mustang was more than a fast aircraft. It was a scientific achievement in aerodynamic efficiency. Its secret began with the laminar flow wing, a thin, precision-shaped surface that minimized drag and delayed airflow separation at high speeds. Unlike conventional wings that generated lift through a thick curvature, the Mustang's design kept the air smooth and attached longer, giving it exceptional stability and speed in dives and climbs. This innovation, though delicate to manufacture, gave the Mustang up to 30 mph of free speed without requiring additional engine power. Then came the Meredith effect radiator, mounted beneath the fuselage. At first glance, it seemed like a vulnerability, a large opening that could disrupt aerodynamics, but engineers discovered that the heated air exiting the duct created a small amount of jet thrust, partially offsetting drag. It was the first time an aircraft cooling system actually contributed to propulsion, an elegant example of wartime ingenuity. Inside the cockpit, instrumentation and control balance were just as refined. The Mustang responded fluidly to pilot inputs, not twitchy, not sluggish, but harmonized. Even at high speeds, it remained stable during rolls and climbs, allowing precise aiming in combat. Combined with the Rolls-Royce Merlin 66 and Packard-built 1650 engines, producing over 1,700 horsepower, the aircraft reached speeds of 437 mph and climbed at more than 3,000 feet per minute. The fusion of airframe and engine wasn't luck. It was mechanical evolution, guided by constant field feedback from combat pilots. Every bolt, curve, and rivet was engineered toward one philosophy: go farther, fight longer, win higher, and that philosophy would soon redefine air tactics across two oceans. Before the Mustang, fighter strategy was bound by geography. Most Allied aircraft were forced to fight close to base, tied to short fuel ranges and limited endurance. The Japanese, with their long-legged Zeros, could dictate where and when engagements happened. The Mustang broke those chains. With external drop tanks, it could fly over 1,600 miles deep enough to escort bombers from Iwo Jima to Tokyo, or from Britain to Berlin. It was the first fighter in history that could go anywhere the war demanded. This range didn't just extend reach, it reshaped the tempo of battle. Japanese pilots once waited for bombers to appear unescorted, knowing Allied fighters would run out of fuel before they arrived. That logic died the day Mustangs appeared over the home islands. They didn't leave after 15 minutes tactically. The P-51 wasn't built for tight-turn dogfights like the Zero. Instead, it excelled in energy fighting, the art of using altitude and speed as weapons. American pilots adopted boom and zoom tactics, diving from high altitude, striking with overwhelming momentum, and climbing away before the enemy could react. At high speeds, the Mustang's roll rate and dive acceleration were unmatched. The Zero couldn't follow without tearing its own wings apart. The difference wasn't just mechanical, it was psychological. For years, American pilots entered battles knowing the Zero could outmaneuver them. Now, they were the hunters. The Mustang's heavy armament of .650 caliber Brownings delivered concentrated bursts capable of disintegrating lightly built Japanese aircraft with a single pass. No longer were pilots forced into prolonged turning duels. Speed, altitude, and firepower replaced agility as the laws of the sky. This tactical revolution reached its peak when Mustangs began escorting B-29 superfortresses over Japan. The Zeros that tried to climb into formation found themselves swarmed from above and shot down before they ever reached firing range. The long-range escort fighter had become both the sword and shield of the Allied air campaign, and as pilots returned to base with half-empty fuel tanks after 12-hour missions, one phrase began echoing across the Pacific: "With a Mustang under you, the sky is yours." The Mustang's engineering and tactics were inseparable. Precision and purpose fused into one machine. But the story of its invincibility wasn't purely mechanical. It was also human, built on the courage of pilots, the desperation of nations, and the fading hope of an enemy watching the horizon darken with silver wings. Every fighter tells a story not just of metal and engines, but of the people inside them. For American pilots in the Pacific, the P-51 Mustang was more than a weapon. It was a promise that they could finally meet the enemy on equal terms and return home alive. Veterans who had survived the early years of the war, men who had flown outdated P-40s and P-39s against Zeros they could barely touch, described the Mustang as a liberation in aluminum when they took off in a P-51D for the first time. The difference was instant. The controls felt light, the power infinite, the confidence absolute. Pilots no longer feared being caught low or far from base. With the Mustang's fuel range, they could choose when and where to fight. They could dive into an attack at 400 miles per hour and climb out before the enemy could even aim. For men who had seen friends burned alive in the jungles of New Guinea or lost at sea over the Coral Islands, this feeling of control, of mastery, was something entirely new. In squadron diaries, the tone shifted. Entries that once spoke of hopeless odds now read with calm precision: 2 Zeros destroyed near Formosa, fuel remaining sufficient for full return. The fear that once haunted Allied airmen was replaced by a steady, mechanical confidence. They trusted the machine, and in return it never failed them. But the Mustang also demanded discipline. Its power was immense yet unforgiving. Overspeed a dive, mishandle the throttle, or ignore the coolant gauge, and even this masterpiece could kill its pilot. That respect created a unique bond between man and machine, an understanding that perfection demanded responsibility. And in that relationship, American pilots found not just superiority, but identity. They were no longer survivors, they were hunters. Enemy angled Japan's vanishing advantage across the Pacific. The arrival of the P-51 felt like a silent catastrophe. For the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service, the early war years had been defined by dominance. Pilots like Saburo Sakai, Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, and Tetsuzo Iwamoto had ruled the skies in their nimble Zeros. But by 1944, that mastery was collapsing. When the first reports of high-speed, high-altitude American fighters began arriving from the Marianas and the Philippines, Japanese pilots didn't believe them. Some assumed they were encountering the P-47 Thunderbolt or the newer F-6F Hellcat, until they saw the long fuselage, bubble canopy, and silver finish of a machine moving faster than anything they could chase. In test flights, the Japanese discovered the truth. The Mustang could climb higher than the Zero's service ceiling. It could dive faster than the Zero could survive. And its armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, bullet-resistant glass made it nearly immune to the light 7.7mm guns that had once shredded unprotected American aircraft. Japan's designers rushed to respond with the Nakajima Ki-84, Frank, the Kawanishi N1K2J George, and other aircraft capable of matching the Mustang's power on paper. But the Empire's industrial base was crumbling. Fuel shortages limited flight hours, engines overheated, aluminum quality dropped. By the time these advanced fighters reached combat units, Japan no longer had the trained pilots to fly them effectively. The Mustang didn't just win through speed or power, it won through sustainability. Each loss Japan suffered was irreplaceable. Each Mustang destroyed was rebuilt in days. To the remaining Japanese aces, the realization was devastating. The very philosophy that once gave them dominance, lightness, simplicity, and range had become their downfall. The new age of air war demanded endurance, protection, and raw power virtues the Zero could never achieve. In letters recovered after the war, one Japanese pilot wrote, "We were still flying the spirit of 1940, while they were flying the science of 1945. Strategic angle. The sky as a weapon, the Mustang's arrival in the Pacific transformed not just battles, but entire war plans. For the first time, B-29 Superfortress bombers could fly deep into Japan with fighter protection from takeoff to target. That single change collapsed the last barrier between American air power and Japan's industrial heartland. In early 1945, P-51s operating from Iwo Jima began escorting bombing raids over Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya. They strafed airfields, trains, and fuel depots, systematically erasing Japan's ability to resist. The Japanese air defense network, already strained by fuel shortages and radar gaps, broke completely under the pressure. Mustangs dominated every altitude, every sector. When the bombers came, Japanese interceptors were either destroyed on the ground or shot down en route. Strategically, the P-51 turned air warfare into a one-sided contest. It allowed the U.S. to bomb by day, cripple industry, and suppress air defenses simultaneously. By mid-1945, the once proud Japanese air arm existed mostly on paper. Even the kamikaze attacks' acts of desperation reflected the same grim truth. Japan could no longer win through skill or technology. It could only sacrifice. For the American High Command, the Mustang had done what no fleet, bomb, or submarine could achieve. It had taken absolute control of the sky, forcing the enemy to fight without air cover, without vision, and without hope. The Mustang was not just an aircraft. It was the embodiment of modern war, precision, endurance, and integration of technology into total dominance. But its true test was the moment where all of this engineering and strategy converged in the battles that followed. Moments where the skies burned, where Japan's last fighters rose in defiance, and where the P-51 proved beyond doubt that it was the future of flight. The turning of the sky by late 1944, the Pacific was no longer a map of islands. It was a vast contested ocean of airfields and flight paths. Each new strip of coral or volcanic rock captured by the U.S. Marines became a springboard for long-range bombers and fighters. And over these islands, the P-51 Mustang began to write its legend. At Leyte Gulf in the Philippines, the first major clashes between P-51s and Japanese fighters unfolded. Operating from newly captured bases, the Mustangs provided top cover for advancing naval forces and ground troops. Above the clouds, the sky was filled with dueling contrails, tight spirals of white, each marking a chase, a kill, or a death. The Japanese still flew their Zeros, K-43 Oscars and the newer Ki-84 Franks, but they were no longer the hunters. When a group of Zeros climbed to intercept an incoming formation, the Mustangs appeared from the sun high, fast, and invisible until the last second. American pilots dived from altitude, hit with devastating bursts of machine gun fire, and climbed away in seconds. The Japanese had no answer. Their lightly armored fighters simply disintegrated under the concentrated impact of 50 caliber shells. At 25,000 feet, the Mustang could maintain full power. At that same height, the Zero's performance faltered, its engine gasping for air, its maneuverability fading. For the first time in the Pacific War, Japan's pilots found themselves fighting on unequal terms. No tactic, no maneuver, no spiritual courage could overcome the laws of physics and engineering. In those duels, the psychological war ended as much as the physical one. Japanese pilots who once believed their skill could offset technological inferiority now realized that the enemy aircraft was simply untouchable. Even veteran aces who had survived hundreds of missions began to fall shot down by opponents who never needed to risk a turning fight. Iwo Jima, the gateway to Tokyo in February 1945. The United States captured Iwo Jima, a volcanic island midway between the Marianas and Japan. Strategically, it was small, barely 8 square miles of rock and ash, but for the P-51 Mustang, it was everything. From Iwo Jima's airstrips, the Mustang could finally escort the B-29 Superfortress bombers all the way to Tokyo and back a 1,500-mile round trip over hostile waters. The long-range escort that had broken Germany's Luftwaffe was now unleashed on Japan. The first mission took off in March 1945, 1,000 miles of blue water stretched beneath the Mustangs as they formed up with the B-29s. At 25,000 feet, the weather was thin and cold, oxygen masks frosting, engines droning in rhythmic unison. Below, Japan waited. As the bombers reached the Japanese coast, radar stations sounded alarms. Zeros and Ki-84s scrambled from airfields near Tokyo, but few reached the intercept altitude in time. Those that did were met by P-51s dropping from above, their silver wings flashing in the morning sun. In minutes, the sky became chaos, twisting smoke trails, flaming wreckage, and black flak clouds hanging over the burning city below. Japanese anti-aircraft guns fired blindly, but the bombers pressed on. The Mustangs weaved around them like guardians, swatting down any interceptor that dared approach. For the first time in history, an enemy capital was under sustained daylight assault from bombers escorted from start to finish. It was a feat Japan's own commanders had declared impossible just 2 years earlier. By nightfall, the B-29s returned to Iwo Jima, many low on fuel. Their engines sputtering, but the Mustangs were still with them. Of the 280 aircraft that flew that day, almost all returned. Japan had lost more than 60 fighters, many with their pilots among the nation's few remaining veterans. The sky belongs to the machine. From that point onward, the air war ceased to be a contest. Every week, Mustangs escorted bomber formations that reached deeper into Japan's industrial core: Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, Yokohama. Fighter sweeps ravaged railways and convoys. Even isolated Zeros trying to defend fuel depots or supply ships were hunted down by roving Mustang patrols. What had once been Japan's proudest strength, its aerial prowess, had become its greatest vulnerability. Each engagement ended the same way: a few brief minutes of resistance, followed by a sky filled with black smoke and burning aluminum. In a war defined by technological escalation, the P-51 represented the pinnacle of piston engine evolution, the limit of what human hands could build before the jet age. It wasn't just faster or deadlier. It was sustainable, replicable, and perfectly adapted to the industrial might of the United States. Every factory could build it. Every pilot could learn it. Every mission could rely on it. The Mustang had become not just an aircraft but a system, the aerial counterpart of the Sherman tank and the Liberty ship, proof that mass production and precision engineering could win wars as surely as bravery and blood. By the spring of 1945, the Zero, that once mythic bird of prey, was reduced to training and kamikaze roles. Against the P-51, there was no longer such a thing as an even fight. The age of individual heroism in the sky had ended. The age of engineered dominance had begun. The skies were now America's domain. But Japan's final defiance, the desperate counterattacks, the kamikaze raids, and the dying hope of the last aces still awaited. And in those final months, the Mustang would deliver the finishing blow that ended the aerial war once and for all. The final sky battles, 1945 by May 1945. The war in the Pacific had entered its final, merciless phase. On the ground, U.S. forces were pushing toward Okinawa. At sea, the Imperial Navy was shattered. But above all, in the thin, cold air over Japan, the war's true turning point was already decided not by armies, but by aircraft. At dawn, waves of B-29 superfortresses rose from Tinian, Saipan, and Iwo Jima, flanked by wings of silver Mustangs. It was a sight the Japanese population would never forget: hundreds of bombers glinting in the morning sun, their escort fighters weaving protectively around them like hawks over a slow-moving herd. On that morning, Japanese radar operators in Honshu tracked the formations and sent the warning: raids inbound. Altitude high, hundreds of aircraft. At scattered airfields around Tokyo and Nagoya, what remained of Japan's fighter corps scrambled to intercept. The airfields themselves were little more than craters. Fuel was scarce, ammunition limited. Many of the aircraft had been assembled from spare parts or damaged airframes. Yet the pilots climbed, some barely out of training, others veterans too exhausted to care. They knew most wouldn't return. High above, the Mustangs waited. Their formation patterns, tight, precise, mechanical, betrayed no strain. Each pilot knew his altitude, his wingman, his fuel load, his radio frequency. When the first dots appeared below, they broke formation like clockwork, diving through the thin air with the steady, confident violence of men who understood both their enemy and their own superiority. In minutes, it was over. The Japanese fighters never reached the bombers. The Mustangs tore through them in coordinated passes, scattering the defense before it even began. Many Japanese pilots, realizing they could not climb fast enough, tried head-on suicide rams, but even those were cut down mid-ascent. The B-29s continued unscathed, raining destruction on factories, rail hubs, and shipyards. Kamikaze and the end of skill. By summer 1945, the kamikaze had become Japan's last weapon, an expression of despair more than strategy. These missions, flown by the young and untrained, aimed to crash directly into Allied ships or bombers. But even this tactic, terrifying as it was, faltered under Mustang control of the air. Mustang patrols prowled the skies from dawn to dusk, intercepting kamikaze flights long before they reached naval task forces. Their range allowed them to orbit far beyond the front, eliminating threats before radar could even pick them up. For U.S. sailors and bomber crews, the Mustang became a symbol of safety, a silver guardian hovering above the Pacific void. By contrast, Japan's command structure fractured. Many kamikaze units never received proper flight paths. Planes ran out of fuel before reaching targets, crashing into the ocean. The few that did break through faced alert gunners and the unending presence of P-51s, diving out of the clouds to destroy them. In Tokyo, officials began to understand what the pilots already knew. The air war was over. Not a single city could defend itself. Every train, convoy, or ship that moved by day risked destruction. Factories could no longer rebuild losses, and without control of the sky, the Empire's armies on the ground were blind. Tokyo in flames on March 9–10, 1945. Before the end of the Iwo Jima campaign, 334 B-29s had already burned Tokyo in one of history's most devastating air raids, but by mid-year those strikes had become routine daily, relentless, mechanical, each one escorted by swarms of Mustangs. When Japanese citizens looked up from the ruins of their neighborhoods, they no longer saw Zeros twisting in defense. They saw endless silver fighters cutting contrails across the stratosphere, unreachable, untouchable, indifferent. These machines did not need glory. They did not need luck. They simply obeyed the precision of physics and the will of a nation that had mastered industrial war. At low altitude, Mustangs strafed airfields, ports, and columns of retreating troops. At high altitude, they circled bomber formations ready to pounce. By August, few targets remained untouched. The Imperial Air Service, once boasting the most skilled aviators in Asia, had lost over 20,000 aircraft and 15,000 pilots. For every Japanese plane still flying, 10 more waited in wreckage on the ground, twisted fuselages, shattered engines, burnt fabric. The Empire had been bled dry of both men and metal. The moment Japan knew it was lost on August 6, 1945, when the atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima, no Japanese fighter rose to intercept. There were none left capable of climbing that high, none with enough fuel to reach the bomber, and none with pilots trained to face what came next. The P-51 had done its work so thoroughly that Japan entered the atomic age already disarmed in the sky. By the time the second bomb fell on Nagasaki 3 days later, U.S. air patrols flew unopposed across the archipelago, a silent statement that the empire which had once ruled the Pacific skies now controlled none of it. When Emperor Hirohito addressed the nation on August 15th, surrendering to Allied forces, many of Japan's surviving pilots wept not only for defeat, but for the loss of the one thing that had once defined their pride of flight. Above the ruins, squadrons of Mustangs continued to circle, engines humming steadily against the silence of a fallen nation. They were not just victors. They were witnesses to the moment when air supremacy became the deciding factor in modern warfare. The P-51 Mustang had ended the war. It was born from not with a single battle, but with the slow, systematic erasure of an enemy's will to fight in the sky. Its dominance would echo into the jet age that followed. The next section reveals the aftermath, the statistics, the legacies, and the lessons that shaped aviation and warfare forever. When the guns finally fell silent in August 1945, the United States Army Air Forces began compiling the colossal data of their global campaign. The numbers told a story of overwhelming efficiency, a transformation of the air war from desperation to precision. At the center of it stood the P-51 Mustang. Across both theaters, Mustangs had flown over 213,000 combat sorties. They destroyed nearly 5,000 enemy aircraft in aerial combat, and thousands more on the ground. In Europe, they had broken the Luftwaffe's back. In the Pacific, they had erased the last hope of Japanese air resistance. Their losses, though tragic, were remarkably low for their scope of operations, a testament to the machine's endurance and the discipline of the men who flew it. For every Mustang lost in combat, multiple Japanese fighters fell before even closing within gun range. By the end of the war, the average kill ratio for Mustang units exceeded 10 to 1. What had begun in 1940 as a desperate design experiment had ended as the most successful fighter program of the Second World War engineering lessons and the dawn of air superiority and post-war reports. Both American and British engineers dissected the Mustang's success. They found no single miracle, no secret technology, only the perfect harmony of existing principles executed with relentless precision. The laminar flow wing had proven its worth, reducing drag and fuel consumption. The radiator system's efficiency allowed extreme range at high altitudes, and the Merlin engine built under license by Packard in Detroit demonstrated that industrial partnership could amplify innovation far beyond national boundaries. For American aircraft design, this became a new doctrine, that performance came not from one invention, but from integration, the seamless cooperation of aerodynamics, mechanics, and human feedback. In many ways, the P-51 represented the prototype of a modern air superiority fighter. It could fight far from home, escort bombers, and operate independently in hostile skies. It blurred the old line between defensive interceptor and offensive escort. The lessons learned from its design directly shaped the first generation of jet fighters. The F-86 Sabre, the MiG-15's rival in Korea, drew much of its philosophy from Mustang data. Even the placement of cockpit controls, the canopy design, and the balance of range versus agility became standards studied by post-war engineers across the world. The Mustang wasn't just a warplane. It was a bridge, the last of the piston age, and the blueprint for the jet age. Pilots in memory. For the men who flew them, the war's end brought an odd quiet. After years of missions stretching over the open ocean, of sunrise takeoffs and twilight landings, the silence of peacetime felt foreign. Many pilots couldn't forget the sound of that Merlin engine, a deep, confident hum that came to symbolize victory itself. In reunion interviews decades later, they still described it with awe. When you opened the throttle, it felt like the plane became part of you. It was alive. In Japan, the surviving pilots faced a different silence. Those who had once ruled the sky now stood in airfields filled with twisted wreckage, relics of an era that had ended abruptly. Some of them, years later, would fly commercial airliners built in cooperation with the same American engineers who had once been their enemies. It was a quiet irony of history that the pursuit of superior flight would eventually unite the very nations it once divided. From warplane to legend as demobilization swept through the armed forces, thousands of P-51s were sold, scrapped, or stored, yet their legend only grew. They became symbols of technological mastery, of how intelligence and precision could turn the tide of global war. Many went on to serve in post-war air forces around the world, from Sweden to Israel, from South Africa to South Korea. The design proved timeless. Even in the age of jets, the Mustang's elegance, its long nose, slender wings, and unmistakable roar remained iconic. It was the plane that didn't just fight for victory, it embodied the victory. The human cost of that triumph, however, lingered. And as nations rebuilt from the ashes, the Mustang's story continued not as a weapon of war, but as a lesson in the fragile balance between innovation and destruction. Japan's reflection. A defeat of industry, not spirit. In the months following surrender, teams of American and Allied investigators combed through Japan's shattered airfields and factories. They found not only wrecked planes and bombed assembly lines, but a deeper story written in steel and oil. Japan had entered the war with some of the most advanced aviation designs in the world. The Mitsubishi A6M0 was a triumph of craftsmanship, hand-built, perfectly balanced, its lightweight frame and airframe tolerances worthy of admiration. But it was also the product of an economy built on scarcity. Japanese engineers had created their early war miracles through precision labor, not mass production. Each plane was a masterpiece of manual skill, and that became its weakness. When the bombing began and skilled workers were lost, the factories could no longer maintain quality. Engines failed, materials degraded, and tolerances widened beyond safety limits. In contrast, American aircraft like the P-51 Mustang were designed for replication. Every part could be produced in bulk, assembled by workers with minimal training, and replaced anywhere in the world. Its genius lay in industrial democracy. Engineering meant for scale, not rarity. Japanese post-war engineers, when later shown Mustang blueprints, immediately understood what had doomed them. It wasn't just horsepower or speed, it was philosophy, a belief that machinery must serve production, not prestige. In 1947, when Japan began rebuilding its aeronautics industry under Allied supervision, those lessons became the foundation of a new approach. Designers like Jiro Horikoshi, who had once built the Zero, began studying American manufacturing systems. They found beauty not in hand craftsmanship, but in interchangeability and efficiency. This philosophy would later power Japan's economic miracle, with the same precision that built fighters for war. Now building engines, cars, and eventually, airliners for peace, a new world of flight. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, the United States entered a new era of confidence. The Mustang had proven that technology, when integrated with strategy and logistics, could ensure total dominance. It was a principle that would soon define the Cold War, an age where air superiority meant political power. In 1946, the Mustang's silhouette still filled runways from Germany to Guam, but a new sound began to rise from the test fields, the sharp whistle of jet engines. Designers at North American Aviation, the same company that had built the Mustang, began work on a new machine, the F-86 Sabre, a swept-wing jet directly inspired by data from the Mustang's aerodynamics. When it took to the skies in 1947, its lineage was unmistakable. The P-51 had taught engineers that range, stability, and efficiency mattered as much as raw thrust lessons that would shape jet design for decades. Even its cockpit ergonomics, the arrangement of gauges, and the pilot's field of vision became standards. In every modern fighter, from the Sabre to the F-16, traces of the Mustang's DNA remain. The machine that united enemies, perhaps the most profound legacy of the Mustang, lay not in its victories, but in its aftermath. Within a decade, former enemies who once fought beneath its shadow were now allies in the same sky. By the 1950s, Japan, Britain, and the United States were cooperating in aviation research and technology exchange. The weapon of dominance had become a bridge of collaboration. In air shows across the world, the deep hum of a restored Merlin engine became a symbol not of fear, but of remembrance. Pilots who had once faced each other in mortal combat sometimes met again older, quieter men who spoke not of hatred but of machines, of craftsmanship, of the shared language of flight. The Mustang, in that sense, transcended its time. It represented both the height of war's ingenuity and the beginning of peace through technology. Echoes of the sky today, more than 70 years later, the sound of a P-51 still draws eyes upward. Its polished aluminum skin, its graceful wings, and the rising pitch of that Merlin engine remind the world of a time when victory depended not just on courage, but on understanding. Japan's defeat in the air became its rebirth on the ground. America's triumph became its responsibility to use that mastery not for conquest, but for progress. The Mustang had ended a war, but its true gift was what it taught humanity afterward, that innovation is most powerful not when it destroys, but when it connects. The battle was over. The skies were quiet again, but the lessons born in those roaring engines would shape the modern world. The story of the P-51 Mustang is not just the story of a machine. It is the story of how understanding conquered fear, how precision triumphed over chaos, and how the minds of engineers shaped the fate of nations. When it first appeared, it was not born from genius alone, but from necessity, a quiet partnership between British insight and American industrial will. It carried no legend, no promise. Yet within a few short years it became the weapon that defined the air war, rewriting what was possible in the sky. Its beauty lay not in decoration, but in balance. Every rivet, every curve, every calculation was built for one purpose: to endure. And that endurance became a metaphor for the age that followed, an age where human ingenuity, once harnessed for destruction, would learn to serve creation. For Japan, the defeat of its once invincible air force became the spark of reinvention. For America, the mastery of flight became a promise of protection and exploration. Together, the two nations that had fought over the Pacific would one day collaborate on the same airplanes that carried travelers peacefully across the same ocean. From the ashes of dogfights and factories rose a shared truth that progress and peace are built by the same hands that once built machines of war. The P-51 still flies today, not as a weapon, but as a whisper of history, a reminder of what humanity can achieve when brilliance meets purpose. Its silver wings reflect more than sunlight. They reflect everything we learned the hard way. In the hum of that Merlin engine, you can still hear it, the echo of a time when the world learned to fly faster than ever before, and a quiet promise that innovation, in the right hands, will always reach for the sky.